Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Ban, and I'm the Executive Director of SPARK, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's podcast. Today's SPARK Talk, so you want the podcast. I'd like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. We are thrilled to welcome Benita, who is a journalist, educator, and media innovator. She's reported internationally from New York, Mumbai, Johannesburg, and has worked in both big and community media, including the New York Times Magazine, Savoy, Vibe, The Village Voice, and WBAI Radio. She's a leader and a mentor both in the newsroom and the classroom, and has taught at Toronto Metropolitan University, the New School, and the National University of Rwanda. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. May I introduce Leija as well? Is that?
Oh, yes, please do.
Leija, how's it going? Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself as well so that we can just both start our chat today?
That sounds good. My name is Leija Navarro. I'm a freelance journalist working in audio and print, so podcast, radio, as well as print. And my focus for most of my career has been on Latin America and on Latinx stories in the US.
Thanks, Leija. Hey, everybody. It's good to be here and see you guys today. I don't know how many of us are here and how many of us can chat, but I wanted to give you an idea of what Leija and I talked about in terms of what we want to share with you, and also wanted to make sure that everybody's here, gets a chance to ask some questions at the end as well. And so the way that we prepared our conversation today with each other was one, that we wanted to talk a little bit about what is, just introduce ourselves so you know who we are, what is Don't Call Me Resilient, who we are at the Conversation Canada, why we started it. And then we also really wanted to talk about, I know that there's a whole lot of conversations right now about, can we consider podcasting to be valid research output as scholars, and what that means for you and your university? That's a conversation that I think you have to have individually with your own tenure committee or university committees to find out if the kind of work that you're doing is going to be considered, valid SRC output or valid research output. But from my perspective at the Conversation, anything that you do to disseminate your knowledge, your research knowledge, is part of that knowledge mobilization piece that all scholars, I'm really appreciative that all scholars do here in North America and Canada. So that's one of the things that we want to talk about is, do you want to make a podcast yourself? And if you do, how do you do that? What kind of podcast might you do? And what are some basic steps to getting there? And then we also want to talk a little bit about, well, if you don't want to make a podcast, if you've gone through all the checklists that we're going to give you a little bit, maybe it's really about how can you be on somebody else's podcast? How can you make those connections? How do you write those pitch letters? And how do you be on our podcast, which is Don't Call Me Resilient? So those are the conversations, the three conversations that we want to get to. Leija, was there anything else that I'm forgetting for the three things that we decided? And then the last thing is the Q&A, of course. But
I think we were going to talk just quickly about the critical race focus of Don't Call Me Resilient, and then kind of introduce that concept and then talk about it later.
Yes. So I'll be talking about Don't Call Me Resilient. We do everything really from a critical race perspective and a critical race lens. So throughout everything that we talk about, that's just the lens that we use. But for sure, absolutely, we do want to, if anybody has any questions about how we do that kind of journalism, we definitely want to talk about that as well. So before we start, I don't know exactly the technicalities of how we are right now, but before we start, is there anything that anybody wants to add to this list of things that we want to go through? No, I'm just going to start talking and we'll get to the questions as we go. Okay. So I'm just going to go through this presentation that I made so you guys can sort of have a visual while I'm talking. Let me just see if I There we go. So who we are, Don't Call Me Resilient. We're actually going into a new format. Up until now, we've been a seasonal podcast and we've done 6 episodes per season. And we do sort of really in-depth episodes. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, we take on some pretty intense topics and we do a good amount of research before we get to our conversation. We're now moving into a different kind of format, which is more of a weekly format and more news responsive. And it gives more opportunity for a variety of scholars, because instead of 6 per season, we're going to be doing 12. So it just gives us a chance to cover and talk to more researchers. So some of the topics that we've covered, in case you haven't or heard us, is things like, what is a land defender? What is critical race? We did a special episode last season about how long COVID is hitting women of color especially hard. We talked about climate change and how that's really impacting the global South. And we talked about decolonizing journalism. And as you guys know, almost all of our guests are scholars. So we mostly work with Canadian scholars, although we have worked with global scholars as well, because we're part of the larger conversation network, which is a global network. And the conversation, so Don't Call Me Resilient is produced by the Conversation Canada. As I said, we're part of the larger global conversation network. We have issues in the UK, in France, in French, in Quebec, in French as well. And so that's an option as well if you're in Spain, if you're interested in publishing in Spanish. And so I just put this photo up. It's one of the most recent articles I published last week. I'm also an editor at the Conversation Canada. And so one of the things I do is I receive pitches from scholars like yourselves, and we work together to put out articles like this one. Most recent, and I really want to talk to you as we go along about how to make a good pitch for us, whether it's in a text article or whether it's for the podcast. So just a quick background, we launched a couple of years ago now. We started right smack in the middle of the pandemic. It was April 2020 when we started planning. And we've so far produced 24 episodes. And one of the tenets that besides trying to do a different kind of journalism, we really work to train and work with graduate students. So we've trained over 6 graduate students over the last couple of years. And we've worked with over 30 scholars. And sometimes we match those scholars with folks on the ground. So for example, one of our last episodes was on gun violence in Toronto. And we worked with an education scholar from Wilfrid Laurier. And when he was a youth, graduated from a youth anti-violence program. And so he brought the director of that program onto the podcast with him to talk about the research from a very scholarly perspective, but also to find out, what's going on the ground very currently. And so the two of them had a really interesting conversation together. This is the team. This is one of the pictures of the teams. I know you guys are very familiar with this view, but I just want to give you an idea. Something that we're really excited and happy and proud of is the diversity of our team on the conversation, on the Don't Call Me Resilient. And then, of course, we really place a lot of emphasis on our guests, which, as I mentioned, are mostly scholars, and our guests are just everything to us. Our main goal is to make sure that we showcase their ideas, their research, their scholarship in the best light possible. And so one of the reasons we really wanted to do this was to talk to scholars about how to best talk about your work in this kind of a public format that's a little bit less, it's not a conference, it's speaking with folks outside of your discipline. I know that many of you do this all the time, media training, etc. But this is the kind of thing that we love to see, is having scholars talk about their work to a general audience. My daughter's 8th grade teacher emailed me the other day and said that he's assigning, episodes of Don't Call Me Resilient on the curriculum. And that's the kind of thing we love to hear. And it's just a reminder that sometimes you are speaking to 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds on this podcast.
Can I add something to that really quickly?
Yeah, please.
That, when we go through the stats of which episodes have been most popular, we find that there's certain episodes that are older, so not from the most recent season, but that the reason that they have huge numbers compared to certain other episodes is because they're being assigned, whether that's to like 13, middle school or high school or university students. So that's, if you're thinking about the idea of possibly being on the show, you're going to reach a lot of people as well as students.
It's so true. I mean, that's one of the exciting things for me is to see how many, you can see every once in a while the numbers really spike. And I'm like, why is all of a sudden everybody listening to, how colonialism impacts climate change, for example? And then you realize, well, someone's put that on a course. And every once in a while, I'll get an email from a student in the US, who's an undergrad who's listening to one of our episodes. So it is really exciting to hear that. So I I put the stats of our audience here, just so you know that at the Conversation Canada, in our text articles, a lot of our audience, maybe 30% of our audience is going to the United States. And I think in the podcast, it's less. We have more in Canada, but still we've got a global audience as well. So I just wanted to share that with you, the audience stats. And then really quickly, just as Leija mentioned at the beginning, we're always talking about how Don't Call Me Resilient approaches conversations from a critical race lens. So whether it's climate change or gun violence or COVID, we really try and feature the critical race lens. And so also trying to shift who we assume to be. We feel that mainstream media in Canada has assumed a certain audience for many, many years. And what we're trying to do is recenter who we believe the audience is. So we do ask questions, perhaps in a different way. I mean, Leija and I can talk a little bit more about that. We can talk endlessly about that, about how we try and approach things differently. And we'd love to talk a little bit more about that with you guys. And so that's just that to show that there has been some really positive reception from general media about how we've been doing things and how we've been doing it differently, which is really exciting to see. This is our new logo, which we're really excited about. We put this out this year. And then this is just a couple of the mainstream, people that we just would not expect to be really excited about critical race are coming to us in different ways. The morning show, Dave Trafford, a real supporter of what we're doing. So Leija, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about why one might want to start their own podcast.
Yeah, great. So this is specifically from the perspective of academics, because, Vinita and I are journalists, but I think most everybody who's probably listening is an academic. So we wanted to really tailor this to your needs. So the first thing that you really, really have to do if you're thinking about starting a podcast is figure out what your objectives and goals are. So that process alone is going to take a while. It's going to require really deep thinking. So we'll get into a little bit about that. But the things you have to determine first are, when you're thinking about your objectives, is this a passion project that you can't fit into your scholarship? Is this something, do you have something that you're really fascinated by, but you haven't figured out a way to make part of your scholarship? That might be a reason why you want to start a podcast. Does your university allow for a podcast to be part of if your tenure track, does it allow a podcast to be part of your tenure portfolio? And there is precedence for this. Let me think of her name. Oh, Hannah McGregor. Of
Feminist Agenda.
Of Simon Fraser University. She was able to have her podcast peer reviewed and so used for her to fulfill her research requirements. So that, if you're able to, if that's already a place at your university or you're able to lobby for that, I mean, that's a great reason to make a podcast. Especially because you can think about it as perhaps reaching more people than traditional academic scholarship might. Other objectives might be, do you work with, or can you think of an organization or a business partnership with whom you want to start a podcast? I'm blanking on Sonia's last name, Sonia Kang, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. She's at TMU in the business school, and she has a podcast.
At Rotman. She's at the Rotman.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And so I'm trying to remember who distributes hers.
Rogers.
Is it Rogers? Okay,
yeah.
So she has a podcast that's about work life. And I don't know if you can describe it better than I am.
Yeah,
Vinita?
she's a Rotman professor, and she works in her research as human resources or human management. And what she's done is created her podcast is called For the Love of Work. And Rogers Media has helped to distribute it. But, so she takes her research and she puts out these episodes that very, in a very non-academic way talks about For the Love of Work, and yet is obviously very much using her skills as a researcher to create her podcast.
And that's something that will.
Another example is Daniel McNeil he's University of Ottawa, I believe. I'm sorry, I cannot remember. Daniel McNeil, he's doing Black Studies podcast. But there's many. Pam Palmater at TMU is also doing a podcast on Indigenous issues, so Indigenous political issues. So there are several scholars who've started podcasts that connect their research to a more general audience.
And that's something that we'll get to a little bit later, like thinking about Sonia Kang and how her, I don't know about the others that you mentioned, if they are more distributed in connection with the university, but if you're thinking about something that you want to potentially get paid to do, like Sonia's podcast that's distributed by Rogers, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so the last thing to think about is starting a podcast a way for you to share your knowledge with the general public? Is this something that you feel really intensely about, and that's part of what's driving you? So we can go to the next slide.
Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so this is a bit.
This is my little pitch in there. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so we just want to remind you, and we'll get to details about this, but do you have an idea for a podcast, or do you have an idea about your research that you really want to get out there, but you don't necessarily have an idea that could sustain a whole podcast? Pitch the conversation, either as an article or to be a guest on Don't Call Me Resilient.
Yeah, I would love to hear from you guys. If you have some ideas for your own episode on our show, I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, I think we have to go back.
Back?
Yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry.
I think
sketch out your podcast proposal. Yeah, sorry. This is the pitch. Sketch out your podcast proposal.
Go to the
elevator
next. Sorry,
pitch.
I think we may have gotten. Oh, okay, great. Right.
Yeah.
So once you've figured out that this is something that you either feel like you really need to do or really want to do, there's still more of this process, of this germination process, this marinating process. And to be really frank, one of the main things that you have to figure out is your idea something that people are really going to want to listen to? Because we all know that, researchers and journalists can become really intensely interested or obsessed with a topic. And sometimes that topic will be really interesting to other people, and sometimes it won't. So that's something that you have to figure out. And part of the way that you can do that really is to spend a lot of time discussing your podcast idea. Some groups that you might want to talk about it with to get a really broad spectrum of feedback are friends who are not academics, family members, colleagues, either in your discipline or in other disciplines, and ask for constructive criticism. You don't want to just have a bunch of yes men who are just telling you, yes, this is a great idea. This is a great idea. You really want people to help you develop the idea, polish the idea, figure out additional dimensions of the idea. And so in talking to your stakeholders, who are interested in your podcast idea, some of the things that you want to talk to them about is this something that they'd listen to? But also, have they heard or read or seen something similar in other media that would make your idea too repetitive? So that's something, it's essentially like doing a literature review, but in video, film, in other podcasts, in both academia and journalistic publications. And then something really important, and this ties into the work of Don't Call Me Resilient, is, are you really the person who should make a podcast on your topic? So for example, if you are a white researcher studying Indigenous topics or topics of an ethnicity or culture that is not yours, think about if there is another way that you can help this idea come into existence so that you don't necessarily take space from other voices. So this is something, we'll talk about a bit later, but we encourage everybody to try to have that critical race mindset in everything you do. And so this is also really important when thinking about a podcast, because the podcasting sphere is still predominantly white. And as a white person, I can say that it's also excessively white. So it's not just that it's kind of overpowering, but a lot of other voices are crowded out. The last couple of things to think about when you are trying to decide about, when you're in the very early development stages, are conduct market research and think about who your audience would be. You can do some poking around online. There is a lot of information about psychodynamics online for if you're thinking about coming up with a podcast, so that you can develop, at least for yourself at the beginning, while you're thinking of what the idea would be. And then also if you get to the point of making a pitch to sell your podcast or make your podcast. And then a really, really important thing is to think about if you really, truly have time to make a podcast, because podcasting is intensely time consuming and it can be, really fulfilling, but it takes a lot of time, and you wouldn't necessarily know that if you listen to podcasts. We try to make them sound as effortless as possible, but they require time and also learning new skills. Depending on if you make the podcast completely yourself, there are a lot of new skills, new computer softwares to learn to edit audio. So you have to sit with that and think about if between your work obligations, your family obligations, other obligations, do you really have time for this? Okay, so now we're on to, if you've decided, yes, I really need to make a podcast, this is something that people will listen to, I've figured out what the audience would essentially be like. Now you have to think about what kind of podcast you want to make. Yeah, please do.
I think that when we're talking about the types, because I think that there are a lot, as you say, so many considerations in terms of time and skills, etc. But I also think that there are a lot of ways to get around some of those skills. So not to scare everybody away that, knowledge mobilization is a big thing when you're writing your SSHRC grants, for example. You can apply for a section of your grant for knowledge mobilization for a grad student, perhaps, who is an audio editor. If you don't have those skills, there are ways of getting around some of these really challenging things that Leija is talking about. There may be some requirements of translating it into French, or vice versa into English. So there are sections of your grants that help you get around some of these large obstacles. And also, just one of the things to think about is, I think we're also, when we as journalists talk about making a podcast, audience and market research is really super important to us. It may not be as important to you if your goal is to reach a very niche group of people who are going, in the way that you might be presenting to a conference. So there are different ways, like maybe your podcast is to reach your students for the next 3 years and you want to add to that curriculum, or you want them to listen to something in a different way. So there are different ways of approaching it as well. You could approach it from a very low tech perspective as well.
Those are really good points, definitely, because while learning a skill like that might take time, there are people out there who know how to do this. And especially, digital natives may have more skills than those of us who are a little bit older.
Yeah. And you can think of it as a short series, we're only going to make 6 episodes ever. We're just going to do our 6 episodes about this topic or about this research project. And it's very simple to, not simple. Let's not call it simple, but you can do it.
It's doable. I like that idea of it being really doable. So we're trying to kind of present to you a range of ways to make it possible if this is something that you want to do. So once you've gotten to the point where you're, set on making a podcast, you want to think about what kind of podcast you want to make. So Don't Call Me Resilient is an interview style podcast. So it's really a question and answer. I mean, it is, orchestrated, edited, but it is essentially an interview between 2 people, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. But so that's one option. Another is to make a narrative series podcast. And this would be the kind of podcast where it could either be one season of, let's say, 6 to 10 episodes, and each episode has a narrative within it, so tells a story within it, and also the series as a whole tells a story. So there would be a narrative through line between all of the episodes. And that can sometimes be just one season. Sometimes you have a really important story to tell, and it's not something that needs to be, become This American Life or Radiolab or something like that. You can also have a topical podcast with individual narrative episodes. And this is something that would be more like those two examples that I just gave of Radiolab and This American Life, where you have, very, very narrative rich episodes, but that each episode doesn't link in a narrative with the rest of the season. So that could be a way to, if you have multiple issues or topics that you want to deal with, but they don't all necessarily fit together in the way that a book might, a podcast could be a way to do that. Or you could make a topical podcast with individual narrative episodes. I can't see my Zoom screen completely. Individual non-narrative episodes. So that would be, I think, trying to think of an example of that, which I'm not coming up with right now, but basically where your show would be about an issue, but wouldn't necessarily be, it might be an explainer. Like, for example, Vinita, do you remember the name of the show about the British Empire?
Yeah, I think it actually is. I was going to say it might be called Empire, but no, I can't remember the name of it.
It's Afua Hirsch from the UK, and
on
so
Empire or something.
It's something about the British Empire. When you're talking next, I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat. But that's an example. Yeah, that's an example of episodes. A series that is really about topics. So it's, each episode goes into a different dimension of the British Empire, the history of the British Empire, and how that ties into present day people in the UK or in the former British Empire. Another option, which might be a little bit more apropos to people who work in literature or English or French, is to make a fiction podcast. That's a really growing dimension of podcasting, is fiction, and there's a lot of room for exploration in that as well. Additionally, there are alternative formats. This is especially for people in the creative fields, especially people who maybe have already worked with film or already worked with audio. When I was putting this together, I didn't have time to kind of think of what examples of this would be, because I think that they are, for now, a bit few and far between. But audio is a really exciting, very open genre that you could do a lot with. For example, one episode of the Don't Call Me Resilient that I think it was an alternative format for the show. And I think it was for an interview style podcast in general, was we had an episode called Sounds of Resistance or Sounds of Protest. And we interspersed an interview with, I am blanking on his name, Norman Long. And what was our other interview's name?
That episode really was about one scholar and one musician, and we basically spoke to the scholar about what's the sounds of protest. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I'm just blanking on the scholar's name.
I don't have that in front of me right now.
Yeah. So that was one that was really exciting to work on, because it was the interview of both of them talking about the sounds of protest. And we also were able to intersperse sounds of protests. So it was sounds from different protests that the scholar had specifically researched around the world, of First Nations protests around Idle No More, of a Palestinian musician who sees his music as being a form of protest, as well as the work of Norman Long, who is the sound artist. So it sounded very different. It was the episode was very sonically alternative. So this is something that you could really look into as well.
Do you
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about the pitching, or
right. Yeah, I didn't, since you'd gone on to the next slide, I had forgotten about that.
I thought, we wanted to talk a little bit about if you don't want to make a podcast.
Yeah.
And if you, whether you do or you don't want to make a podcast, I think what's really important to this conversation as scholars is to think about how to write that pitch. So the pitch is, are you writing, we did talk about the real podcast that is really directed towards a small niche scholarly audience. But what if you want to write something like for the Conversation Network? Everything that we produce is going out to a general news audience or a general audience. So it's an interdisciplinary audience. And whether or not you want to make a podcast yourself, or you want to make an episode, or you want to be on an episode, that pitch is equally important for either one of those things. When it comes to creating a pitch for your own podcast, it's something that is going to be quite a bit more in depth, and you're going to have examples of episodes that you're going to write out. For example, your series, you want to have your explanation about, 3 or 4 lines about your elevator pitch about what this podcast is about. And then your 6 or so or 12 episodes that you have underneath that. But when it comes to pitching one episode, that's the one that I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to talk about specifically pitching to the conversation. And before I get into how you pitch, I was wondering if you guys can indulge me while I play three clips in case you haven't had a chance to hear any of our podcast episodes. I wanted to give you a sample. I just checking the time. I think we do have a few minutes. They're just 1 minute each. And I'm going to play the first few so you can get an idea of how folks sound. And these are some of the best episodes, the best performing episodes that we've done.
Can I just add something to that quickly?
Yeah.
That this is, we chose these examples because the scholars are talking in a very conversational way. And so if you're going to pitch yourself as being on a podcast or creating a podcast, that's really something that you have to work on, either accentuating what you already have or hone a kind of a conversational way of talking rather than purely academic.
It's troublesome and it's complicated.
Yeah.
But at the root of all that.
Okay, so this is Cheryl Thompson, and she is a professor at TMU, and she's talking about the use of the N-word. And so I'm going to play this for you.
Is still trauma. For me, it doesn't matter if it's coming from Black men or white men. That word is a traumatic word, period. So either you are celebrating trauma or you're enacting trauma, but it's still trauma for me.
Okay, these are short, so bear with me while I grab the next one. Oh, hold on. It's not going to let me go back in there. So I'm going to play it like this. Here's the science one.
Science is extremely clear.
This is Yvonne Su, and she's professor of Department of Equity Studies, and she studies environment as it relates to equity.
Science is extremely clear who has emitted the most historically to contribute to human caused climate change. We got the evidence, we got the receipts. We just don't want to recognize it. And I think it's going to continue to be a big source of tension, and there might be a watershed moment in the future where really this has to change. So if we know all of this, why can't we get our act together as a global community and find solutions, especially solutions to the social aspects, the social tensions that are going to arise?
Okay, one more, guys, and then I'll stop. Doesn't want me to play it from there. 1 second.
Own the land owns us. We are her. Own the land owns us. We are her people. And
this is the voice of Ellen Gabriel. She's a human rights activist, and she was on this podcast with the scholar talking about land rights.
Own the land owns us. We are her people. And I think that's why we do this, is that people understand their ancestral teachings, is that we need to protect the land for this generation and for future generations.
So that episode, we really were talking about land defenders, indigenous land defenders. And she was explaining, that we don't own the land. And I'm trying to, and the scholar that she was on with was talking about it from a scholarly perspective, and Ellen Gabriel was talking about it from historical perspective of being the activist there for 20 years. Can I stop sharing screen and we can just face each other for the next 5-10 minutes while we have our conversation with each other? I'm not sure how to stop sharing. Is that all about me? Pause share. Sorry,
Here,
do
I can, oh, no, I can cut it off. Yes. Oh, no, that did not work. Yeah, just re-hit share screen and it should go away.
Oh, re-hit share? No, it's asking me. Oh, stop share. Sorry, I got
Stop
it. Sorry. Okay, I want to stop talking because we've talked so much, and I think there's a lot that we threw at you there. Before we get into our conversation, what I really wanted to go through is 3 things that I think are really important in terms of the pitch. So I'm just wondering if anybody has pitch ideas, if anybody has questions, before I jump into that. Maybe we can, it's better to ask questions. I think we have just a few minutes left with each other. Okay, I'm going to tell you what the 3 things are that I would say when you're talking about pitching for us for the conversation. So say you want to pitch an article or you want to pitch a podcast episode. These are the 3 questions that I would ask myself if I was a researcher. And what I would love to have people ask me when they talk to me is, okay, 1, have you been able to connect your research to a current event or a current trend? And 2, can you explain how those things are connected? So the 3rd thing is, I would say, if it is something that's a current event or a current trend, my advice is to move quickly. So if you see something in the news, or you hear something, or you hear people are talking on the ground about a specific issue, then my advice is to send a note to me or to one of the editors at the conversation as soon as possible. Hey, I'm thinking about this as an article or as an episode, and this is what I would like to talk about, or this is what I would like to write about. And how can you connect that to your research? The second thing that I would say is write in short sentences. This is such a journalist thing to say, but write in short sentences without using any academic jargon, if at all possible, so that you're fast moving or very busy. We're all busy, I understand, but your fast moving editor or producer can quickly get into your topic. And then the other thing that I would ask, or I would suggest that you do, is explain why you think potential readers or listeners will care what you're talking about. And then make the point as to why you think it's compelling and why you think it will add value to listeners or readers, but also the news outlet that you're talking to. And then it always helps to add some resources and context with what you're sending. So send a quick link to the article, the news article that you're talking about, or send a quick link to your most recent research. Sorry, I've got a question. So please, Allison, go ahead.
So I both have a question, and then I also want to bring Tony Hong briefly into the conversation. He manages resources here at McMaster for people who want to build podcasts. My question is that as a podcast listener, I get overwhelmed by the variety.
Yes.
And I wonder, is it just personal perception around market saturation? Are there metrics? Does anyone know?
There's a lot of podcasts. There's no joke. It is a very crowded space. In that crowded space, there are between 5 and 10% that are actually sort of, really like listened to. There's a very, very, very long tail of podcasts. And it's really, if you have 10 listeners, that's very valuable. If you have 10 listeners that come to you every week and it's your community, that's valuable to you in a particular way. So it really does depend. I mean, we have 120,000 or downloads at Don't Call Me Resilient, but we're a different kind of podcast. So yes, it is a crowded market space. I could probably find you some stats to explain how crowded it is. There is some conversation that if you have 3,000 weekly listeners, you're in the top 1% of podcasts produced in Canada.
Wow.
So yeah, something like that. There are many, many podcasts. When we're in season, we have about 3,000 a week. So we know that we're in that top 5% in North America and the top 1% in Canada. And in Canada, the space is less crowded, but still crowded. It's kind of like, do you remember when blogs first came out? We're like millions of blogs, and you know that there doesn't mean that you don't do it just because there's millions of them.
Tony, would you like to jump in and say anything about resources here?
Yeah, sure. I am Tony Huang, an educational developer here at the McPherson Institute. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm more from the technical side of like actual audio recording and producing. So it's fantastic to hear your thoughts and process and ideas so I can share this knowledge to people that are also looking to record podcasts. So just to speak on to your earlier point about resources,
Yeah.
we do have actual dedicated studio spaces to record podcasts. So we can do that through hardware. We have 2 microphones, like an isolated room to record as well. It's free for staff and faculty. So you can just email me and we can get a booking session going. Or for another example, for grants, or if your project is funded, we've had people come in and just record themselves, and then they'll actually send those files to an editor or somebody else.
That's
So
good.
there's a lot of different breakdowns of processes that can really help. And really, I'm here to support this, and I'm really excited to hear more about it and try and get this going more. So that's really
That's
great.
cool. So Tony, I was going to say the one thing that we have a lot of trouble with when we book guests is the sound quality, and especially, you know, not to say, we all know that we've lived through crazy times and we've had to make recording studios in our house, etc. Mine is still in my house. But thinking as yourself, when you're booked as a guest on whether it's a media, you know, spot or whatever it is, you're making your own as a scholar to get the best quality audio that you possibly can. That's my number one advice. So if you've got somebody like Tony's says that you've got studios, if you're from a different campus, then I would say please call your comms department and ask for help with that kind of setup. If you do have to set it up at home still because you don't go onto campus, then I would also suggest calling your comms department. They can help maybe get you a reasonably priced USB microphone that you can plug into your computer. Those small things really help. There's a question about a graduate student wanting to link their podcast work to their evidence-based research. I would suggest that you check out the Amplify network at Wilfrid Laurier University. They have a whole thing online, lots of information about peer review process for podcasts.
And they have a pipeline for making either peer-reviewed or non-peer-reviewed podcasts. So they, I think, would be the absolute best.
It's a very nascent, as you guys know, field in terms of peer review podcast, but their work is amazing and fascinating. So I would take a look at it.
Can I throw out too, there was one thing that we didn't get to, ideas of where people can pitch that if they have podcast idea, where they can, how they can pitch one or create one. So the kind of the top tier would be a production company that funds and distributes the podcasts, such as Wondery or Audible or Gimlet, any number of these are the ones that produce like the biggest shows. And the CBC also has.
I was going to say, don't forget the CBC.
Exactly. No, the CBC has, if you just Google it, you know, pitch podcast CBC, they have a specific web page for that with instructions about how to do it, an email to send your pitch. You can also apply for grants or funding to produce the podcast and then produce and distribute the podcast yourself independently. So this would be something where, like, if you're applying for a SSHRC grant or any other type of grant or funding. Amplify, which we just talked about, which is an imprint of Wilfrid Laurier. And the last option, which is not to be discounted, is to just produce the podcast yourself without funding. If you're absolutely unable to get funding or for whatever reason, you know, tons of people do that. And some podcasts that have become really popular were initially started just by people, you know, figuring out how to make a podcast on their own and doing it.
Yeah. For sure. I think I don't know how much time we have left. So I just wanted to double check to make sure. Are there more questions that anybody have any questions? No? Anybody have any ideas? If you have any ideas, we're going to start our weekly podcast soon. The Don't Call Me Resilient is going into weekly production mode soon. So really, we, one of the first things that we were talking about last week is the rising police budgets across Canada. But we were also talking about Bill 92. I mean, there's anything that's sort of currently in the news that you guys are thinking about that may connect to your work and research. I'm really open to hearing from you.
I'll throw out one that some community partners and I have been talking about a lot, which is how the different images of drug use that have come out of the opioid crisis, and white people with a lot of privilege getting hooked on opiates, and sort of these now two narratives of substance use, that it's all the same thing and it's all the same experience, but because it fits into these narratives of sort of who's a person of value and who isn't, that we have really created two different characters around who are substance users.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That'll be super interesting. And so in that case, in that kind of a pitch, the first thing that I would want to know, as somebody who knows nothing, from the, so I would want to know, tell me who you are as a researcher, tell me the work that you've done, and tell me how it connects to the idea that you've just talked about. And so those are the three things that in the pitch, if I'm just looking at a quick email, then those are the things that I want to know. Like, it's a great idea. So then now how do we connect it to a longer? And then I guess the second thing is there somebody that you would want to talk to with about that? Is there a doctor, or is there, I don't know. I'm just throwing out some ideas. Is there an addiction research specialist, or who
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah. Anybody else have
Don't
any?
be shy. If you have other questions, please, anything. We're happy to talk about anything.
I think you can throw some things in the chat if you want to.
Yeah.
Maybe you have 2 more minutes, and then I think we're supposed to wrap up. Is that right?
We were supposed to wrap up at 11:20, but we don't hold too tight to that. People
Okay.
tend to wander off when they need to.
Okay. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, I guess that what I would say is I'm just going to leave with, you guys know how to reach me, I believe. I'm Vinita Srivastava at The Conversation Canada. And where you can find me is there's a link that says pitch us in the back, how to contribute to the conversation. Ideally, editors like to get pitches through that system. So the pitch us system is the best way to go. Depending on your discipline, you may pitch to the environment editor or culture or education, etc., or the science editor. And everyone there is equally amazing and interesting in terms of, we really all love the work that we do, and we love speaking to scholars. So pitch at us all the time. If you want to speak to me about an episode of Don't Call Me Resilient, please feel free to just email me. If you have questions about this presentation, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk about it at any time. And I really would love to hear your ideas. If you have ideas for episodes, if you have ideas for colleagues who you think might make good guests, feel free to make those introductions. Yvonne Sue came to me through an introduction. Liz Dubois at the University of Ottawa connected us. So those kinds of things do really help as well. So thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And thanks for staying with us beyond our scheduled time of 11:20. It's nice to see you all on Zoom. I wish that we could meet in person someday soon. And as I said, feel free to reach out anytime. I'm not going to put my name in the chat because you guys know how to find me, I believe.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, I will not even pretend that we at Spark have figured any of this out. We are learners in this process too. So if other people want to kind of keep exploring this, everyone at Spark would be eager to keep up those conversations as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this anytime. I mean, and we didn't really talk so much about our critical race, Leija, but it is everything that we do. So anytime you guys want to talk about it again, we're here. Love to do it.
Before we hang up, I just had one idea too that might help some people. If you have a journalism program in your university, and you have an idea about a podcast, go see if you can find somebody in the journalism school who will talk it through with you. There are also podcast consultants that they charge quite a bit, but you may be able to kind of figure out a trade somehow with somebody in the journalism school to help you, or journalism department to help you kind of hone your idea. And also find undergrad or grad students to help you with the audio editing.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you. Thanks
everyone.
for the invitation. Take care.
Thanks.